The Muslim says, "Rather, I say that the existence of a universe governed by general, regular, and comprehensible laws is a fact that, like any other fundamental fact, requires philosophical explanation."
The atheist comments. Repetition doesn't make the formulation any more meaningful. Existence can be a fact, of course, but it remains unclear to me what exactly is meant by an explanation for existence, since this explanation would also require an explanation.
The Muslim replies, "When I use the word explanation, I don't simply mean to describe something anew or to give it a different name. Rather, I mean the explanation of the reason or basis that makes its existence or its properties comprehensible. When a physicist explains the fall of an object with gravity, he hasn't simply renamed the phenomenon, but has linked it to a deeper principle that explains it. Similarly, when a philosopher asks about the explanation of the existence or order of the universe, they investigate whether these facts exist independently or are based on a deeper underlying truth. As for your statement that the explanation itself requires an explanation, this is fundamentally correct and the crux of the philosophical problem. The debate, therefore, revolves around whether the chain of explanations can continue indefinitely or whether it ends with a fundamental truth that requires no further explanation. I am not excluding explanations from the question. Rather, I acknowledge that the question includes them. If every explanation, without exception, requires another explanation, then this applies not only to my position but also to yours. You would then have to explain why energy, the universe, or the laws of nature are irrefutable truths. The question, therefore, is not, does an explanation require an explanation? But rather, is there a point at which the legitimate need for explanations ends? My concise and convincing answer is this. By explanation, I mean the explanation of what constitutes a truth, and not something non-existent or different. If every explanation requires another explanation, then the question arises, does the chain of explanations lead to a fundamental truth, or is it endless? This is the crux of the philosophical debate, not merely a vague use of the word explanation. The Muslim says, if all morality is subjective, how can we say that slavery, genocide, or child torture are truly wrong, and not merely actions we disapprove of or reject?
The atheist comments. We cannot say that.
The Muslim replies, your position has consequences that are practically and rationally difficult to accept. If we cannot say with certainty that slavery, genocide, or child torture are truly wrong, then their condemnation is nothing more than an expression of personal preferences or psychological aversion, just as someone might prefer a certain color or a certain type of food. Most people, however, do not approach these issues in this way. When we describe genocide as evil, we generally do not simply mean that we dislike it. We mean that it is wrong, even if society as a whole tolerates it, even if the perpetrators benefit from it, and even if they consider it right. The question, therefore, is not, can we shape morality subjectively? But rather, does this align with our fundamental moral judgments? If morality is entirely subjective, then there is no objective basis for condemning Nazis, slave traders, or child torturers. The rejection of these crimes becomes merely a matter of taste and values. Is this really what we mean when we speak of justice and injustice? Or put more simply, if one accepts that genocide or the torture of children cannot be definitively categorized as wrong, one is not denying the existence of an objective morality, but rather accepting a radically different philosophical conclusion, that these acts are not inherently evil, but merely acts that we reject. The moral conflict between victim and perpetrator then resembles the conflict between someone who prefers tea and someone who prefers coffee, a conclusion that, in my view, contradicts our immediate moral experience. The Muslim says, within the framework of subjective morality, moral judgment ultimately becomes an expression of individual or collective preferences, not a binding moral truth.
The atheist comments. Correct. I also see no way in which binding moral truth could be established, for example, by tracing it back to the subjective preferences of a mythical god. Subjectivity remains.
The Muslim replies, the debate here is not simply about God's preferences, but rather about the nature of the foundation upon which moral values are based. This is the crux of the matter. If morality were merely a question of individual or collective preferences, there would ultimately be no qualitative difference between someone who says, I like honesty, and someone who says, I prefer to lie if it serves my interests. Both merely express a subjective attitude. The divine conception of morality, however, is not necessarily based on the idea that good and evil are merely the personal preferences of an omnipotent deity, but rather on the notion that moral values are rooted in an objective reality that transcends individuals and societies and reflects an absolute spiritual and moral nature, not merely fleeting desires. In other words, if God were merely a being with arbitrary preferences, your objection would be valid. However, if God were the objective foundation of good itself, the situation will be fundamentally different. For here, good derives its legitimacy not from personal desires, but from an existential reality that transcends individual and collective preferences. Therefore, the question remains, if we reject the existence of a transcendent basis for morality, what makes a judgment like torturing children is wrong a moral truth that goes beyond mere human opinion or feeling? On what is the basis for transforming moral judgments from mere preferences into binding truths if any objective point of reference beyond the individual and society is excluded? The Muslim says, "For if one denies the existence of an objective morality, one must show how moral judgments can transcend personal preferences and inclinations."
The atheist comments. On the contrary, it would have to be shown that there can even be moral judgments that go beyond that.
The Muslim replies, "I am not shirking the burden of proof, but rather pointing out a problem with your alternative proposal. Undoubtedly, anyone who asserts the existence of an objective morality must justify this. However, this does not absolve those who deny it from the obligation to explain the consequences of their position. If you claim that all moral judgments are merely subjective preferences and inclinations, you are making a philosophical claim that also requires defense and justification and cannot be considered an axiom. Furthermore, the question remains, when we describe actions such as torture, genocide, or injustice as wrong, do we mean that we simply disapprove of them, or do we mean that they are inherently wrong regardless of the whims of individuals and groups? If the answer is the former, you must explain why we discuss, argue, condemn, and blame moral wrongdoing, rather than simply saying, "I don't approve of this behavior." If the answer is the latter, you have already moved beyond the realm of subjective preferences and approached objectivity. The debate, therefore, is no longer solely about who bears the burden of proof, but rather about which interpretation best aligns with the nature of our actual moral judgments and practices. In light of the foregoing, we must shift the discussion from the mere question of who bears the burden of proof to a more profound one. Does moral subjectivity actually explain how we think and speak about good and evil? The Muslim says, however, if one believes that certain actions are wrong regardless of the views of individuals or society, then one has already approached the concept of moral objectivity, even if one rejects this term.
The atheist comments. A subjective opinion doesn't make something objectively wrong.
The Muslim replies, "That's not what I meant at all. I agree with you that a personal opinion alone doesn't make something objectively wrong. I didn't say that the mere conviction that an action is wrong makes it an objective moral truth. Rather, I was saying that someone who considers an action wrong, regardless of individual or societal opinions, implicitly holds a moral view that transcends mere subjectivity. The issue here is the nature of the moral judgment being made, not simply that it is a personal opinion. When someone says that torture or genocide is wrong, even if everyone agrees, they are not merely describing their own feelings about it. They are asserting that there is a standard that classifies these actions as wrong independent of the opinions of others. And here lies the question, where does this standard come from? If there is no standard independent of individuals and groups, on what basis is an action wrong, even if everyone considers it right? It turns out that when I argue for independence from human opinions and preferences, I'm not arguing for objectivity based on personal opinions, but rather for the content of the judgment itself. The Muslim says, therefore, I do not consider the second question irrelevant. Rather, it is the question that determines whether morality is more than mere personal preference.
The atheist comments. No, the question should first be, can morality be anything more than personal preference?
The Muslim replies, the two questions are closely related. Your question does not avoid the first, but examines it. I agree that this is an important question and, of course, part of the discussion. However, the question, what makes morality more than just a personal preference, cannot be separated from the question, is there a basis for it? If you say that morality can be more than just a personal preference, you must explain what gives it this quality. If you say that nothing gives it this quality, you're already taking the position that morality is nothing more than subjective preferences. Therefore, my question is not a replacement for yours, but its natural continuation. It is not enough to ask, can morality be objective? We must also ask, what explains its objectivity, if it exists? The mere assertion that we must first prove the possibility of moral objectivity does not solve the problem, because the core of the discussion revolves around which explanation captures the essence of our moral judgments. Are they merely preferences, or do they refer to standards that transcend these preferences? The answer is short and to the point. The question is valid, but as soon as we examine whether morality is more than just a personal preference, we arrive directly at the question, what makes it more than that? The two questions do not contradict each other, but rather lead to the other. The Muslim says, then the terms justice and injustice do not describe any moral truth, but merely feelings, preferences, or social conventions.
The atheist comments. Why merely? We have no other option and try to make the best of it.
The Muslim replies, the word merely is not used here pejoratively, but serves the philosophical distinction between two different kinds of statements. I am not using merely to diminish the importance of feelings or social norms, but to describe the basis of moral judgments in this view. If justice and injustice merely express feelings, preferences, or social norms, they do not describe a reality independent of these feelings, preferences, and norms. That is precisely what merely means. Your statement, we have no other choice, is a different claim that requires proof. The question is not whether we can build practical moral systems based on feelings and norms. Of course we can. The question is rather, are our moral judgments objectively correct or merely expressions of convenient human preferences? A moral system can be useful, stable, and necessary for social life without being objective in the philosophical sense of the word. This is the crux of the matter. In short, objective does not mean that feelings or conventions are unimportant, but rather that they alone are insufficient to make a moral judgment an objective truth. The question is not, can we live by them? But, do they make justice just and injustice injustice, independent of our preferences? This is the crux of the debate. The Muslim says, in this case, one cannot say that the oppressor is acting objectively morally wrong, but only that he is acting in a way that displeases us or that does not conform to the values of our society.
The atheist comments. Why only? It is already a great achievement if such a smoother coexistence is ensured.
The Muslim replies, I do not deny the value of social coexistence, but I distinguish between social benefit and moral objectivity. I agree with you that a smoother and more just coexistence is a very important achievement. But that is not the point. The word merely here does not diminish the importance of this goal, but rather distinguishes between two types of justification, utilitarian or social justification and objective moral justification. If we reject injustice simply because it hinders coexistence or contradicts our common interests, then we've explained why we reject it, but not why it is inherently wrong. My question is, if an individual or a group could achieve or enforce their interests through injustice without jeopardizing their stability, would injustice still be wrong? Or would it be acceptable from their perspective? If the answer is that it remains wrong even then you are speaking of a standard that transcends utility and social preferences. If the answer is that injustice has no meaning outside of these considerations, then talk of justice and injustice becomes an expression of social preferences and not an independent moral truth. Therefore, we must focus on the crucial point. Social utility may explain why we adopt moral rules, but it does not necessarily explain why these rules are objectively right. The Muslim says, are you prepared to say that slavery, genocide, or torture are not inherently wrong, but have only become wrong because we reject them or because modern society condemns them?
The atheist comments. Yes.
The Muslim replies, I appreciate your clear position. If that is the case, then do not say that slavery, genocide, or torture are inherently wrong. They are simply saying that we reject or disapprove of them. Then it has no objective meaning to say that the proponents of slavery or the perpetrators of genocide acted morally wrongly. They were, in turn, expressing their own values and preferences, just as we do today. Thus, the conflict between human rights defenders and proponents of slavery or genocide does not become a conflict between right and wrong, but merely a clash of different tastes and values. If you accept this conclusion, you are indeed taking a consistent, subjective position. But then another question arises. On what basis do we state that, in fact, has moral progress taken place? And how can we claim that the abolition of slavery represented a genuine moral improvement, and not merely the replacement of one set of societal preferences with another? This phrasing shifts the debate to a crucial point. If morality is entirely subjective, then the very concept of moral progress becomes questionable, because change is not a transition from wrong to right, but from one preference to another. The Muslim says, however, if you believe that some actions remain unjust even when supported by the entire society, then you need a standard that transcends mere personal preferences and societal consensus.
The atheist comments. I disagree, because morality is always a matter for a particular community. Therefore, what is considered permissible within that moral community may appear wrong, here, unjust, from an external perspective. The reverse would also be true. A shared assessment of, for example, justice would only arise with a new, comprehensive morality that unites both communities in consensus.
The Muslim replies, your proposal does not contradict my argument. Rather, it reinforces the moral relativism you mentioned. I understand your point, but your statement seems to me more like an affirmation of moral relativism than an objection to it. If justice and injustice are defined exclusively within the respective society, moral judgment is subordinated to the standards of that society. In this case, it no longer makes sense to say that an entire society has acted morally wrongly, but merely that it differed from another society. This, however, raises an important question. When we criticize societies that practice slavery, genocide, or systematic discrimination, do we mean merely that they were different from us, or do we mean that they were actually wrong? In the first case, we abandon the idea that injustice exists beyond societal boundaries. In the second case, we presuppose the existence of a standard by which society itself can be judged, rather than merely judging it by its own internal standards. Talk of a new universal morality emerging from a broader consensus merely shifts societal standards and fails to answer the fundamental question. Does something become just simply because it enjoys broader consensus, or can the consensus itself be flawed? Would slavery be just if the whole world were to agree on it one day? If so, then the standard is consensus, not justice. If not, then there is a standard that transcends consensus. This last point is often crucial in such debates. Does consensus create what is right, or does it discover it? If it creates what is right, then no consensus can be called unjust or wrong. If it discovers what is right, then there is a standard that exists independently of consensus itself. The Muslim says, if one person loves injustice and another hates it, what makes the one right and the other wrong?
The atheist comments. Nothing but the morality of the community to which they have joined.
The Muslim replies, if the only criterion is the morality of the society to which a person belongs, then moral right and wrong become entirely relative to that society. But then another problem arises. How can the morality of a society be judged? Is it morally right for a society to tolerate slavery, oppression, or genocide simply because that society practices these things? Answering this question in the affirmative means forgoing the possibility of criticizing society from within or judging it as morally wrong. Answering it in the negative means presupposing the existence of a standard by which society itself, and not just its individual members, can be evaluated. Thus, considering society as the ultimate source of morality does not solve the problem. It merely shifts it from the individual to the collective level. The question remains, what makes the morality of one society more right than that of another? Or, to put it succinctly, if a society's morality is the highest standard, then we cannot say that an unjust society was morally wrong, but merely that it was different from ours. Do you see the abolition of slavery as the exposure of a moral error, or merely as the exchange of a social custom? That is the crux of the dispute. The Muslim says, if there is no higher standard than preferences, we will no longer have a moral right and wrong, but only competing opinions.
The atheist comments. That is wrong. We do not have an objective right and wrong. And of course, opinions compete. That is precisely why consensus is so important, in which the individual submits to communal morality in order to share in the benefits of living together while minimizing the disadvantages.
The Muslim replies, I do not dispute the importance of social consensus, but rather the confusion between what is agreed upon and what is morally right. I think your answer confirms my statement rather than refuting it. I don't deny that societal consensus is crucial for organizing community life and minimizing conflict. However, the question I'm discussing isn't, how do we build a stable society, but rather, what makes a moral judgment right? If the overriding criterion is societal consensus, then a moral judgment is right because society has accepted it, not because it possesses intrinsic moral value. In this case, it cannot be said that society itself acted morally wrongly, but merely that it followed different standards. However, we don't usually describe societies that practice slavery or oppression simply as different from us. We say they were wrong. This judgment implicitly presupposes that there is a standard against which societal consensus itself can be evaluated. So, consensus explains how moral rules emerge in a society, but it doesn't answer the question, why is this particular consensus morally right and not another? I can summarize the idea in one sentence. Social conformity may explain the source of moral rules in a society, but it doesn't explain why that particular conformity is morally right and another is not. That's precisely the point of contention. The Muslim says, your conclusion goes beyond what the first law of thermodynamics allows. It makes an unjustified conclusion that energy is conserved in an already existing physical system during physical processes.
The atheist comments. But that is precisely the statement of the first main theorem.
The Muslim replies, you are confusing the wording of the law with a philosophical interpretation that goes beyond the original context. This does not correspond to the first law of thermodynamics. It states that energy within a physical system subject to the laws of thermodynamics is neither created nor destroyed. That is, the total energy remains constant during physical transformations. However, it does not answer the question of the origin of energy itself, nor the reason for the existence of the physical system. In other words, the first law presupposes the existence of a physical system and the presence of energy, and then describes how this energy behaves and transforms within it. The conclusion that energy or the universe are eternal simply because energy is conserved in physical processes is an additional conclusion not derived from the first law itself. The conservation of a certain amount of money in transfers between accounts does not prove that this money had no origin. Likewise, the conservation of energy in physical reactions does not answer the question of the origin of energy or the universe. If you would like a more technical answer, I can add that the definition of energy conservation in modern physics is not absolute in all cosmological models, but rather related to the properties of space-time and physical symmetries, and that therefore the first law is not direct proof of the eternity of the universe or of energy. The Muslim says, however, it does not answer the question, is this system eternal, or did it have a beginning?
The atheist comments. Not the first law of thermodynamics as such, that's correct. However, taken together with the fact that everything our universe consists of is a form of energy, from the singularity of pure energy to the emergence of matter. Since the entire system is made of energy, the system must also be eternal.
The Muslim replies, this conclusion does not follow from the premises I have presented. Even if we accept that everything in the universe is ultimately different forms of energy, this does not prove that energy is eternal. The first law of thermodynamics describes what happens to energy when it already exists in a physical system. It transforms from one form to another without being destroyed or created anew. However, it does not answer the question of whether energy itself is eternal or whether it has a beginning. To say the universe is made of energy and energy is conserved, therefore energy is eternal, is an unjustifiable logical fallacy. Conservation over time does not necessarily imply eternity. Something can have a certain beginning and then be conserved according to a certain law. Furthermore, the standard Big Bang model suggests that our observable universe was once in a state of extreme density and heat, and physicists do not conclude from the law of conservation of energy alone that the universe or energy is eternal. Therefore, the question remains, do energy or the universe have a beginning? It remains another metaphysical or cosmological question that is not answered by the first law of thermodynamics. I can also summarize the answer in one crucial sentence. The conservation of something after its existence does not prove that it did not originally exist. The first law speaks of the conservation of energy during physical processes, not of its eternity. The Muslim says, the question of the reason for the existence of energy also remains unanswered.
The atheist comments. I can't make sense of your formulation. It is too vague and can mean several things, a cause or an intention. But we can only say that energy exists. A cause is not needed, since energy is uncreated, that is, eternal. And if something is eternal, then it is independent of any intention.
The Muslim replies, by the reason for the existence of energy, I did not mean a purpose or a goal, but the existential explanation or basis for why energy exists at all and not. However, your comment presupposes precisely the point of contention. You claim that energy is uncreated and eternal, and conclude from this that it requires no explanation. But the very eternity of energy must be proven, not presupposed. Furthermore, eternity itself does not necessarily answer the question of explanation. Even if we were to assume, purely hypothetically, that energy is eternal, the philosophical question remains: why does this particular eternal reality exist? Why do energy and its laws exist, and not nothing at all? To say energy simply exists is not an explanation. It is a reliance on a supposedly self-evident fact. This is a possible philosophical position, but not a scientific conclusion or one dictated by the first law of thermodynamics. The question, therefore, revolves not around purpose or intention, but around an existential explanation. The assertion of the eternity of energy solves the problem only if one first demonstrates the reality of eternity and then explains why it eliminates the need for explanation. In summary, one can say they don't answer the question, but rather anticipate its answer. They consider energy to be eternal and conclude that it requires no explanation, even though the very eternity of energy is the point of contention that requires proof. The Muslim says, the conservation of a quantity after its creation does not imply its eternity before its creation.
The atheist comments. As a reminder, there is no creation. This contradicts the first law of thermodynamics.
The Muslim replies, you are arguing circularly, and this does not correspond to the first law of thermodynamics. This law states that energy is neither created nor destroyed in the physical processes described. However, it does not claim that the universe or energy are eternal, nor does it exclude the possibility that the physical system itself had a beginning. Your statement, creation does not exist because the first law of thermodynamics forbids it, therefore presupposes that the law of thermodynamics is applicable to the origin of the universe itself. This is precisely where the point of contention lies. The law of thermodynamics was formulated to describe the behavior of energy in the universe, not to answer the metaphysical question of why the universe exists or its origin. Furthermore, my statement was not an argument for creation, but a response to a logical fallacy. Even if we were to assume, purely hypothetically, that something came into being at a certain moment, its subsequent conservation does not prove that it was eternal before its existence. This is a logical point, regardless of how the origin of the universe is interpreted. Consequently, one cannot use a law that describes the conservation of energy in a physical system to prove that the physical system itself had no beginning, because that goes beyond the scope of the law. I can summarize the answer as follows. The first law describes what happens to energy when the physical system already exists, but it does not prove that this system is eternal. To use it to deny a beginning of the universe is therefore to extend its meaning beyond its scientific scope. The Muslim says, the established view is that energy is conserved in the universe, but the question of the origin of the universe itself is another.
The atheist comments. No, it is exactly the same question as long as there is nothing in the universe that is not a form of energy. Then there is no origin for either energy or the universe.
The Muslim replies, this conclusion does not follow logically from your arguments. The fact that everything in the universe consists of different forms of energy does not prove that energy or the universe itself has no origin. They infer from the statement, everything in the universe is energy, or one of its forms, the statement, therefore, energy is eternal. This conclusion, however, does not deviate from the premise. The question of the nature of something is different from the question of its origin. For example, if it is said that everything in the ocean is water, it does not follow that the ocean is eternal. And knowing the composition of something does not automatically answer the question of its origin. Furthermore, the conservation of energy means, at best, that energy is neither created nor destroyed during the physical processes described in the law. The assertion that energy has no origin is an additional statement that requires independent proof. It is not a consequence inherent in the law of conservation of energy. Therefore, two fundamental questions remain. 1. What is it made of? 2. The universe, energy, and its various forms. 3.2. Is this physical reality itself eternal, or did it have a beginning? 4. The answer to the first question does not answer the second. In summary, it can be said, the fact that energy is the fundamental building block of the universe does not prove its eternity. It answers the question about the composition of the universe, but not the question about its eternal existence or its beginning.